We went yesterday in some depth on the theme of latent powers of consciousness which are waiting to emerge in the normal process of our evolution. When our higher ranges begin to open and turn down to the lower ranges, they also begin to unpack, decompress some of these powers and bring them into more direct operation. This unfoldment has many practical results. We touched upon some of these yesterday while on this theme. There is another practical result which I want to dwell upon, and having explored that a little bit, we will then move on to any questions you have which may be pending from yesterday or even from this morning. Sri Aurobindo is exceptional in many ways, and one of the most important uniquenesses of his approach is that he never takes things on faith or on belief alone. He always goes back all the way to first principles, and on the very objective foundation of first principles rebuilds everything, but from a deeper insight, a broader perspective. And he takes up the question of senses. We have 5 senses. What are senses? We know them only in our body from operations of certain organs. But if you begin to analyze them, you will discover that the difference between these 5 senses is not so great. You have a sense of sight, hearing, taste, touch, and smell. But what's the difference between taste and smell? It's tongue coming in contact directly with an object, and there is a chemical reaction sending signals to the brain. The smell is also skin surface coming in contact with the same molecules of the food as they have drifted off from the food and floated in the air, and it catches a more refined form. We call it flavor instead of taste. But again, feeding back electrical signals to the brain. What's your skin doing? It's also touching, but not so much through chemical engagement as smell and taste, but through friction of some kind or pressure of some kind, and translating into electrical signals. What is your hearing doing? Vibrations, not unlike finger touch, but directly picked up from the air, and turning those vibrations somehow into a kind of a tonality. And that's not done in the ears. It's still electrical signals going to your brain, which turn it into the proper sense of sound and pitch. And the sight is also finally a skin surface responding to light, translating into electrical signals, and which go to the brain. Where is the actual sight taking place? Not here inside the eyes, not inside the electrical nerves which connect to the brain. We might say it's taking place in the brain, but actually it's not even in the brain. The brain is only the link point, the plug for the mind to plug into the body. And it feeds into the mind, and the mind sees, the mind hears, the mind touches, tastes, smells. If you disconnect the brain or the nervous system, the mind doesn't get its input. And so you say, I can't hear anymore because of damage in the nerves or in the eardrum or whatever. But the mind has so fixated itself into this plug of the brain and through the nervous system into the body organs, that when you disconnect somewhere along the way, the mind does not receive. It says, I can't hear or I can't see. Not realizing that the actual hearing and seeing is taking place in the mind, and the mind could disconnect from the plug of biology and directly perceive because it's the seer, remember. There is an exceptional case documented in France, I believe it was during the First World War, medically documented, of a man who was born blind. His biology of sight did not function. But he could see. And they couldn't figure out how he saw. Except there was a problem. Every time he got upset, he got emotionally disturbed, he became blind again. You get the idea now. What was seeing? The same mind. But it had unplugged itself from the brain and was operating its sight perception directly. But when there was an emotional disturbance, it clouded the mind's free action. Interesting. In Russia, there's documentation of a person who picked up a book one day in the middle of the night, and his fingers touching the surface of the book, he knew what was written on it. And he said, "What's this?" And he began to explore. And he discovered that with his fingers he could read. He could distinguish between colors. Eyes closed, you can run your fingers and read. Is the finger photosensitive? Actually, biology confirms that your skin surface responds to light to some degree. But can it actually distinguish between printed text and colors? And so he began to experiment with others and found he could teach others to do the same. All of us have innately this ability. And the same with our power of hearing. I don't know if you observe, if you've ever noticed this, if you're in the middle of a room where 100 people are speaking, at first there's this sound. That's how they say it in the comics. And then your mind tunes in to one person. And after a while, it's as if all other sounds fade away and you're able to hear only that person. If you're listening to an orchestra, 50 pieces, 100 pieces, if you tune in, you can distinguish a single instrument. And that power of tuning has nothing to do with your eardrums, it has everything to do with your mind. It's where your mind puts attention and the mind is able to isolate a single instrument. If you're listening to a recording, it's slightly more difficult. If you're listening live, it's easier because with your sight, you can focus on that instrument or that person who's talking. And then as if with your sight, your mind's attention tunes in and automatically cuts out all the rest and focuses on this. And then there's something even more interesting. If you start this, you tune into a person, and after a while, set yourself at a greater and greater distance, you notice at a pretty far distance where normally physical hearing would not register, you can still hear. And there are people who are specialized in this to a degree that we say they are lip readers. Try it out, it doesn't work. You can't do it by reading lips alone. But you can do it if you tune in with your mind and somehow more than the lip reading, which is only the mind focus, you tune in with your mind, you literally hear what's being spoken, even through a window pane or from a recording. Interesting. All our senses, potentially, can be directly experienced by the mind, bypassing the biology. So what prevents us from doing it? Habit. What happens in dream state? When the subtle body disengages from the physical to whatever degree, you have direct access. And that's why in dream you can see, hear, taste, smell, and go through all the senses in your subtle body. But when you wake up, you replug. By habit, your mind is fixated through the physical biological organs. But if it can happen every night in your dream state, you can also do it now, consciously, with a little bit of training. And it's not too difficult. When the higher consciousness takes up the lower working of the mind, and the mind's plug into the biology as the physical senses, it lifts them beyond these limitations. First, it opens the mind's senses, widens them, brings into them a great depth and richness. And second, it allows the mind to perceive through the biological organs as well as directly at the same time, as if superimposed. And so in this awakened consciousness, heightened awareness of mind. As you gaze upon the flower, not only you see its physical form, you also see its subtler, finer ranges of reality. And in an initial perception, it will be as if the flower is so incredibly beautiful that I have no words to describe it. You're looking at the same flower, but you do not see what I might be seeing. But I also know what I'm seeing is not what I normally see. There is as if an ethereal, magical, divine glow or reality to it. It is as if somehow more real, more concrete, more vivid. And even in that perception, one has the sense that the colors have a wider range, which is the reality to the pure action of the mind in the subtle body. If you enter into the subtle worlds in dream state, the range of colors is so much larger, so much deep and rich, and even translucent, that on waking up, you cannot map it to the physical sight and memory. So it's like here's a huge range and here's a small range. How do you map it? So in attempt to map in the waking state, it reduces it to something which looks grayish, almost black and white. That's why there are people who claim that you dream in black and white. No, it's not true. You dream in such rich color that compared to it, your normal range of sight color is black and white almost, so to say. And I remember this, the first time when I had an experience like that. I was in dream, I was at a very young age. I was seeing something and I was seeing its color, and the color was so rich, and then something woke me up. And I had the continuity of consciousness all the way to waking, and I could see the color dimming, graying into the waking state. And what I had was a pale recollection of what was then in the dream. And the mother speaks of this. She says, in the subtler worlds, the ranges are so much rich and deep that eventually somehow a way has to be found to represent them in the physical world. And she says, a way will be found. And we see a little bit of this on the computer screen, where you get 16 million colors and with translucency and vibrancy and richness, which is difficult to have in matte surface of non-glowing screens. But that's not it. There is almost the divine element of it in the flower, when you can see as if the radiance of its soul, but you're seeing it. And the same in the hearing and taste and touch and smell. In all five senses, this higher consciousness infuses its perception and lifts the senses to their higher working. But at the same time, having freed the mind from the fixation in the biology, the mind operates also directly. So while you may be seeing the scenery of this room, your mind then might want to know, well, what's beyond? And as it turns to want to know, it perceives something or senses something, as if touching in awareness, or even listening, hears at a greater distance. And these things begin to happen more and more spontaneously. In its natural state, in the mind consciousness, free from the biological dependence, where will you see? You see, being in the fixed body, you are seeing through your eyes. But in the mind freed from the biology, which direction will you be seeing? There's nothing limiting you. So would you be seeing in one fixed direction and moving around, or spontaneously to the mind, which is directionless, you will be aware in all directions? Which is, as I mentioned yesterday, what happens during dream state. You walk into a space and you're aware of everything around it, around you. In fact, often people will describe in dream state, they may say, I was at a certain place but I didn't have a body. Why? Because the sight was multidirectional, so they are not conscious of something hanging below the sight or the sight being narrow to give you a fixity as if in physical space. And the same with all the other senses. And in the dream you might often notice you turn to something which is interesting and as if immediately you zoom in. Physically, where you have the sense of going close. There's no movement. There is only the mind focusing, dwelling on, and immediately that zooms in. So one of the powers which comes with this freer perception You can look at the flower and then as if zoom in, tune in to go closer, deeper, and you look at the petals and then you say, where's this color coming from? And you can zoom in further as if perceiving at its molecular structure. And there's a very interesting text which is published now more than 100 years ago by the Theosophical Society. It was written by Annie Besant and the gentleman Ledbetter, C.W. Ledbetter. And what they did together, Ledbetter went into a altered state of awareness, trance, whatever you might choose to call it, and with his liberated consciousness began to study molecular and atomic structures with the sight, as easily as you would study the physical form of the flower. And they took different elements, chemical compounds as well as elements, and went deep into it, describing the atomic structures. At a time when physics had not yet fully organized its understanding of the elements, or even of compounds. And then they went deeper. They saw the atoms as formed of electrons, protons, neutrons, whatever names they may have used at the point. And then they went deeper. What is an electron made of? Going into the electron, my descriptions now come from my memory, so I might be off, but you can look at the book yourself. Going into the electron, they discovered the electron itself is made of 3 subcomponents, which today we know as quarks, and so on, until they went to what they considered to be the smallest fundamental particle, which they found to be a vibrating ball-like structure, pulsating, living as if, and itself was formed of 7 fine threads of glowing energy, rotating and whirling within and rotating around and whirling within, like a little tornado, mini tornado, self-sustaining, but pulsing at the same time. Fascinating descriptions, all of which today are validated by physics. As far as physics has been able to go, there's been no difference so far. Nothing which distinguishes, which can say they were wrong, except physics has not gone deep enough. Even when it comes to that last particular perception, physics has come up with models which speak of reality having multiple dimensions corresponding to these fine threads of light. And then they went deeper, and into that they found little globules, and they said when you break it up further, it's no more physical matter, it becomes subtle matter. Now, all this was done very objectively. Subsequently, more recently, I believe some 20 years ago, there was a Buddhist monk in the US who was tasked with a similar effort. He came up with similar drawings. It can be validated objectively. You could do it yourself if you had the ability and verify that yes, it works. But if you can go deep, you can also go large. Because your consciousness now is no more limited to the body and the borderline of the body. It can open out, and mind itself is vast, freed from the body. And you can perceive the whole of this space, or as if perceive this space as if from above, or from within, or from multiple directions at the same time. Now here's the problem of our physical sight. If I look at this flower, I can see it only from the front, or from the side, or from the back, or an angle at a time. Can you see this flower from the front and back and top and bottom at the same time? Your eyesight would have to as if wrap around it. But you can't do that with the physical eyes, but you can do it with your mind awareness. And since the mind is seeing, the mind can embrace the flower and see it simultaneously from all directions, but it won't stop with that. The mind fills the flower and sees it from inside out equally. Amazing. And look at what happens next. Remember, mind was the focal point for you to dwell on something. Hearing, taste, smell, touch. So when your mind embraces the flower from all directions and from within out, it's also smelling the flower, touching, tasting, hearing at the same time. Because your 5 senses are not really separate. They are all aspects of the mind perception. Consciousness meeting consciousness. What happens at that point? And if into that higher perception has filled in, you feel also the glow of the beauty and joy and love and the soul of the flower. And when you experience that in identity, what happens? You are flower. You know flower intimately as flower knows itself, from its divine essence all the way to its form blooming. You are it. That's the point at which your sight, perception of senses has been lifted out from the physical sense through the mind sense into the intuitive sense itself. The intuitive consciousness has its own perception of the senses, of which the mind is a reduced form, of which your physical senses are a still reduced form. Interesting insight. We discover now every plane of consciousness, every grade has its own sensory perception, unique to it, but each is more free, more deep, more rich, all the way into the intuitive and beyond. We have then a glimpse of what the divine sense is like. When the divine sense looks at the flower, it does not just see form of flower, as your physical sight sees, it experiences oneness with flower in soul, in spirit, in consciousness, and the full experience of flower blooming, including the richness of the flower's journey from when it was a bud through to its blooming. So when you know flower, you experience the whole burst of the joy of the flower as it bursts open. And all of that is simultaneously in your perception, in your identity of experience. But it doesn't end there. The consciousness itself, as it rises higher, remember we said was free of space and time limitations. So it perceives in the flower all the trends of its self-fulfillment. What happens next? What are the directions in which it's moving? And even there is a sense of the journey of the flower when it finishes, expends itself and withers and falls back into the soil. You literally experience the full life journey of the flower, with the distinction with what has been built up and the trends of what might happen, all in one continuum. This same perception now turned to a person, turned to a situation, turned now widening to the whole world, sees, experiences in identity no more as an objective, separate observer looking only at surface forms, but an inside-out experience of the whole trend of an entire civilization. From what roots it lifted itself up, what were its primary drives, what were its special and unique forms, and then its expenditure of energy and loss of vitality and the dulling and collapse of the civilization and the full journey of that movement in all its multiple facets you experience. Now, if you've read Sri Aurobindo's description of the human cycles of civilizations and etc., you will see the kind of precision and broad view that he has. It's not possible for the mind to come up with that. You would have to study millions of books and still you wouldn't be sure how it all fits together unless you've experienced it. And that's how he glimpses. He sees the truth. He dwells upon it until the full thing reveals, and then he articulates it in a language that captures something of this fullness. It is this movement which we call Trikala Drishti. Traditionally, Trikala, 3 times, 3 periods, Drishti, vision. The vision that sees past, present, future in a single continuum. And it doesn't mean the future is fixed. Neither does it mean the past was one simple thing. In the past, there were many efforts struggling to fulfill themselves. One of them succeeded in the realm of matter. But in the vital and mental worlds, they are all as vividly present. And you experience all of them. In the present, there's a particular outcome, but there are also other forces which attempted but failed, equally vivid in the mental and vital worlds which you experience. And into the future, you see the same trends of forces struggling, trying to form themselves and express as these multiple possibilities, with the most likely trends felt distinctly as if more formed. In a multifaceted vision, hearing, taste, touch, smell, sensory identity. You don't have words for it. That is the divine sense. You can call it divine sight, divine hearing, but there are still facets of the divine sense itself. You can see how it's something so different from what we have. And yet when we describe it, somewhere deep within us it resonates and we say, yes, of course, this should be possible. In fact, That we don't have it is the surprise, isn't it? We should be able to experience everything like that. It's meant to be enjoyed like that. That's how the divine experiences the universe and everything in it. And now you look back at the current development of your physical senses and your mind's role in it, and you see, we are at such an early phase of that possibility. But it's not going to take 1,000,000 years, because the higher consciousness seizing upon mind and physical sense can lift it in a few moments into this experience. But we might not be able to sustain it, and then it might drop back. These are those occasional glimpses that we have of something extraordinary, something supernal, indescribable. And as if everything becomes beautiful, magical, and so on. But you can, by sustained effort, not only rise into it and descend and rise a few times, but begin to live more and more close to it until eventually you live in it. And then within that there might be further gradations as you go higher into the fullness of the divine sense. But still, the journey can begin where we are right now. Why would you fall back? Because of habit. Notice what happens every day. You wake up from sleep, you're dull, heavy. Your thinking is as if more dull, more sensory based. At the first step of waking up, you don't even have rational thought. You have sensory thought or emotional thought, if at all you can call it thought. It's so uneasy, it's too cold, too hot, and then what's this? You curse a few people, all instinctive responses. But then afterwards, as you come into your own, you take a shower, your mind begins to think, and then you notice the shift that takes place. Your thoughts become more clear. If you ever made the mistake of writing a letter when you just woke up from sleep or in the middle of the night, abusing somebody for not being nice to you, if you ever made the mistake of sending it off in the middle of the night, you wake up and you look at it and say, my God, what did I just do? Such a huge difference between the conscious waking mind and this half-sleepy, dull, sentimental, emotional mind, which is so convinced that it's right because it is passionately pulled and pushed by the violence of its emotion, not clarity of its thought. But the moment you come into clarity of thought, you say, oh, what a terrible mistake. And as big as this difference, which is really small, bigger than that is the difference between the still higher working of the mind from this range and still beyond. But if we can rise from the waking state to this conscious poise, you notice when you have a special effort to make, you have to present something to your company, your boss, pass an exam, do something special which requires an optimum of your poise, you find yourself lifted up to a still higher state in your peak performance. And then from there you drop back and settle into your normal, or perhaps initially even below normal, to rest before coming back to normal. There's a continuous fluctuation in this vertical awareness. And the norm, which is your norm today, was earlier your peak, and you've grown perhaps. Or occasionally, as happens with people, from my peak or norm, I've fallen because of certain lifestyle habits. But you can rise again. And if this fluctuation is so fluid, well, you could also work a little bit and shift your norm to a higher grade, and then your peak would be slightly more, potentially. And it doesn't take much. It's just that we were never taught that this is important. In school, did they ever tell you about this? Did they ever make you conscious that you were shifting levels? And somehow society never talks about it. So where's your reference? Unless you notice in yourself and you say, oh, there's a shift. But what do you do about it? You don't realize there is so much more waiting. And nudge a little bit every day. And with it, not only in the heightening, there is a widening and a deepening, and all these consequences of the high ranges of intuition as they fill in. But your effort can only rise so much. When opening to the intuition, it fills you, it lifts you, it can do in a trice what you might take years to do. And it may lift you a few times until eventually it begins to settle, it begins to fill you, and it begins to lift you, and there's a kind of an up and down movement, a descent and an ascent. I don't go too much into detail, but this is the technology, so to say, of consciousness, awakening, developing, ascending, widening, perfecting, transforming. And the technology itself is precise. Its laws, its processes are precise. They're fluid in the working. It's not like a mathematical thing you can measure, but the movement is accurate and precise in what it does, and the processes are very clearly described and drawn out and can be activated and developed consciously. The result, though, will be in your life as you experience things, everything becomes so much more worthwhile. With it, what we would call powers are activated that are not really anything special when you think about it. Your freed mind can look anywhere in the universe now. Why should it even limit itself beyond the wall? It can look at the planet Mars, and there's a Mars rover which is sitting there. Let me see what it's doing. And your mind leans out and interesting. And it might see things which the rover is not seeing. In the United States military, they discovered that Russia was actually experimenting with these powers, psychic powers as they call them, for purpose of military spying. And the CIA came to the conclusion that they were behind, and so they had an accelerated program in the early 70s, and it was led by one of most famous psychics in America, Ingo Swann. And they did a series of experiments, and then finally they made him design a training program. They found that every human being has these powers to some degree, less developed, more easily developed. And they designed a program, they identified the types of human beings who could be more effective in this. It's an extraordinary study, a matrix of 256 parameters that were measured. And they found 2 parameters which were critical. If you had those, then you would be very successful in this. And then they identified people in the military who had those 2, got them together, trained them. An entire program was developed. While doing that, Ingo Swann got bored. He said, what are you asking me to look at what's in a park, what's in an aircraft, what's in a military base, or where is the location of a certain missile? Boring. And there was a news item that NASA had just sent a craft to Jupiter. It was to reach within 2 months or so. And Ingo Swann said, let me see what I will find on Jupiter. And so he goes through this exercise of projecting himself onto Jupiter. From above and from within, he describes various things, including, fascinating, a ring around Jupiter, and then looking from below into the sky, sparkling dots which were diamond-like, describing the nature of the base on which he was standing. And he described it almost metallic, and yet it was not metal. It was almost like a dense gas which had been compressed into metallic. And on the horizon he saw mountains. According to all of best science of the time, it was impossible for any solid mountain structures on Jupiter. They didn't know anything about rings. So he made 13 references of what he observed, which were unique. The craft reaches Jupiter, and in the very first few months of the data it sent back, out of those 13, I believe some 7 were confirmed, and another 10 confirmed by subsequent craft, another 3 confirmed by subsequent crafts, including the things which I described. And not only that, he was made to spy in other ways, all of which, much of this now is declassified. You can even see the images drawn, the precision of it. I'll share one example there, or 2 examples. In the first one, they were asked to spy on a facility in Russia, which was a large enclosed building, far from the edge of the ocean, and they had not been able to get their ground spies to go in. So the person doing this work is tasked to go inside with his inner sight, and he describes a large structure which looks like a submarine, except it's too far from the edge of the sea. And he describes slanted missile silos, which is never done in a submarine. And then he's asked to measure the size. It's too big to be a submarine. Next, they say, now project yourself 1 month in the future and describe what you see. Interesting. For the mind sight, not only physical space but even time is fluid. So 1 month later he describes what happens, 2 months later, 3 months later, and then suddenly he says there are a series of explosions and the seawater rushes in and the object floats out. So now they had a date. So the CIA put all its spy satellites pointing at that date, and precisely on that date there was a series of explosions, the seawater was brought in, and the world's biggest submarine floated out. And it had those slanted silos, etc. Everything was confirmed. This is part of declassified documents, it's nothing new. Many such, there are 10,000 declassified documents showing images, drawings made with all these descriptions. Part of it involved projecting yourself to view, sense people's thoughts. So during Operation Desert Storm 1992, when the US half invaded Iraq, didn't complete the job then, but at that point they were monitoring the state of Saddam Hussein's mind daily. What were his thoughts? What was he planning to do? And the strategic responses from the military side were determined based on what he was thinking. Interesting. Imagine what a power it gives you to know the enemy's mind. And so one of those remote viewers, they were called, one of them had this, he doesn't say which, some head of state in the Middle East. He had to monitor his mind, write down, he finished his report, and then he takes his car to drive home. And as he's driving home, his thoughts turn to what he has to do for the house, and in his mind he checks off a grocery list. I have to buy this, buy that, kill my wife, then go to sleep. Oops, what happened? He screeches a halt, brings his car to the edge of the road. What did I just do? Buy the grocery, kill my wife, go to sleep? What was that? And he goes back into the exercise he had earlier to monitor that man, and he discovers he had picked up that man's thought which had now remained in his consciousness. 2 weeks later, that man's wife vanished. She was never heard of again. And then that's when they realized that entering someone's mind was not a simple affair. They were coming back contaminated because the entry was in the vital and mental perception. And so there's a kind of a sticky stuff that remains. And they developed a process to detox, to separate themselves from that kind of an identification. And it became part of the protocol. You enter, identify, experience, then separate and cut off the link. Otherwise you get sucked into their mess. It's the same problem with healers, People say, oh, I'm going to heal you, they pump energy. What they don't realize is that energy is a two-way connection. In the very act of attempting to heal another, their illnesses or energies can come into you and contaminate your consciousness or bring the same illness into you. So there's a whole domain and the whole science behind it. And I'll end with one, which was the example I wanted to actually initially start with. So when the military was validating these, there were always people who were skeptics. And in one case, a very senior military ranked officer came and said, okay, I give you a tasking. Describe to me this base. And the way they would do it, so as not to contaminate with the mind's expectations, they would write in an envelope what place they wanted you to monitor. And on the envelope, a number would be written. And to the remote viewer, the number would be read out. Now you see how complex this is. You don't know anything except a number. When the number is spoken out, your mind as if tunes into what the number represents for the person who asks, and then enters the experience of that. So no contamination of your expectations. Now he begins to describe, here in this mountain space, there's this entrance, and then there's a passage which goes in. It was a kind of an underground facility. And on the right side, there's a door which opens to, and as he's beginning to describe this military man gets up and says, stop, you don't have the classification to enter into that space. Stop it immediately. He was just describing a secret facility which nobody else was supposed to know of. That's the kind of freedom the mind has. Where can you go? Anywhere. What stops you? Nothing. You can experience everything. That's why we were meant to explore the whole universe. Down to the atomic details and out to the galactic spaces, everything is available, but not with just the superficial form, with this deeper insight. The remote viewers were nowhere near that. But the divine sight is something far more rich and complete. But I give you these examples to show you that there is a continuum. There are possibilities which your mind can have as it is right now without any opening to higher consciousness. But with the awakening of the higher, all this becomes natural but also more complete, more true, more real. And this is part of the waiting ranges of our evolutionary development, which are very close. Sri Aurobindo describes, I do not have the exact quotation, but he describes how there are such ranges of beauty and peace and calm and joy and light and bliss waiting for us in the ranges which our current evolution has not yet touched. That if humanity had only a glimpse of those, it would leave aside everything that it is doing and not rest till it had found them. Such wonderful things, just there. But he says nature prevents us from going too rapidly into those realms, and the gatekeepers, he says, are doubt and I think it is fear, I'm not sure. Is it possible? Oh, someday when I'm retired, another life. Okay. But if you have had even a little bit of a glimpse, you realize how much more there is which is waiting, against which all this is so insipid. But that is not to be experienced there alone, it has to be brought here to fill this, that this can become an expression of that divinity. So this is a broad presentation of the theme of development of latent and inner powers. There's much more to the whole discussion, but I think this is a useful point to pause, and we can take up your questions. Yes.
I had a question yesterday that I still like to present. And when you talk about going beyond time and space, I'm trying to plug in what you mean exactly by supramental and the quantum field that's outside time and space. So I'm thinking I'm hearing something a little different today about like many levels of the quantum field. Mm-hmm. Yes, but that is what you're referring to as supramental?
Well, first of all, I will not use the word quantum field, because quantum field is a very physical experience and a very basic level of an underlying sense of unity which is perceived. In physical processes where you're still very much embedded in space, time, and even physical energy. That it exists as a field which links things across great distances is because there is an underlying reality which unites it all. So what you are measuring as a quantum field is only a physical reflection of a deeper spiritual reality. So
still within time.
Very much time and space and within matter only. The moment you have shifted even to the vital world, you're free of all these quantum and other descriptions. And it's much more complete already. And then the mind, and then beyond that, all these ranges of the spiritual. We call it technically, we begin to use the word spirit or spiritual of the nature of spirit from the point where you experience consciousness as undivided. In the mind, you're still experiencing as divided. As you rise above, there are ranges. In the intuitive consciousness, there is the perception that there is a unity, but you still experience a part of it. But you perceive the unity already, and you experience a part of it, and then ranges subsequently where it becomes more and more complete. So there's a whole spectrum of a continuum of levels ascending, all the way into the totality of it. If I had to describe the supramental, it'll be in these terms, if you want to see how the sequence works. Your mind right now, remember, is taking one piece at a time, joining with another piece, comparing, differentiating, and analyzing, synthesizing. A step above is what Sri Aurobindo calls the higher mind, which sees things not as one piece, one idea at a time, but as a range of ideas, as if looking at the flower or the situation from multiple directions at the same time, with multiple thought perceptions of it simultaneously. So it's as if thinking in parallel. You look at the situation and simultaneously you're aware of many different aspects to it. But the thought itself now is multifaceted and larger, more inclusive. It does not see little pieces, but broad perspectives. That he calls the higher mind. And if at that point you're seeing, knowing, thinking from all directions, there's a point where the thought process itself begins to fade and the perception of the situation begins to stand out. And when the perception stands out and there is no more need for a thinking mentation process, you look and you see. That's when you have lifted beyond higher mind into illumined mind. And there it is perception and sight which grow, and there's a flood of light which begins to fill, and the light illumines and reveals. But there is still the sense of I observing the other in a vast perception. Out of that, as you're observing from all directions and from inside out, as I described earlier, there's the beginning of an identification. And then everything you seek to know of, you experience an identity. There's no more I observing and knowing an object. I am one with what I know. At that point, you have lifted up through to the intuitive mind. The intuitive mind knows things by identifications, identities, smaller or larger, depending on how it rises. And so I wish to know how this car works. And I look at the hood of the car and I'm aware of the engine and the axle and the structure with the wheels. I then turn to the engine for further detail and I'm aware of the pistons moving and the shaft within. I then turn to the pistons, I'm aware of the rings by with which the piston moves and the spark plug. I dwell on the spark plug, I'm aware of the distributor. Series of flashes filling in, and in a more developed, more mature intuitive mind, I would look at the car and I experience the whole in one go.
But we're still in time and space.
You're still in time and space, but in your consciousness, you are able to already perceive the before and after. So when I see the car and I experience it, I know where it came from, I know where it's going, and there are insights which you could not have had access to, both for the past and the future. I look at the situation and I say, oh, there's been a lot of pain before this happened. It's going to take some more time and then it'll fade out after a while. You can even see, sense, in identity. If somebody could experience what you are experiencing yourself to be, there will naturally be the memory of the past and the sense of it carrying, and the sense of your expectation and turn to the future is a part of you. So the past, present also extend into this intuitive consciousness. But the intuition becomes more wide, more free, more series of flashes until the flashes become one sustained lightning of filling, widening. And at that point it turns into what he calls the overmental consciousness, which sees from the perspective of the whole, the entire universe leaning to become flower. Flower existing as form of the whole universe, and everything is seen in a continuum, of which flower is the center. I shift my attention now to the plant. Plant is the center of the continuum of the whole. So in the overmental consciousness, everything is seen in the totality of the infinite, but with a bias, with an aspect, with a special focus, perspective. But two different focal points can clash. The flower infinity and the gardener infinity, or the stone infinity, could be contradictory to each other. And then there is one more gradation of consciousness above, in which all these are seen as facets of a single unity, indivisible whole. That is what Sri Aurobindo calls the supramental. And the entry into the supramental itself, he describes finer three gradations of stages which result into the wholeness of the unity.
So are we outside time and space here?
So all of this in the supramental consciousness is experiencing space and time in a continuum, past, present and future. There is no outside or inside. It is one continuum of a whole. When that supramental consciousness enters in relation with a particular object, it has at the same time the poise of seeing it above space and time, within space and time, within the context of the whole and within the individuality of the whole. And all four are simultaneous as one continuum. Of these, at any of these stages, you could step out of the space-time experience at that level. Getting out of space-time is not part of the evolutionary journey. It is the exit from the evolutionary at that level. So in the physical consciousness, you could step out of space-time. In the mental consciousness, you could step out of space-time, and even in those higher gradations. But stepping out in the mental consciousness, looking back at the universe and the world, you will say, it's an illusion. Because mind cannot unify this state of free from space-time with being in space-time. It has to cut up, remember, reality. And so it will say, world is illusion, my space-time transcendence is reality. Because you did it through the mind. You go into the intuitive consciousness and step out of space-time, you'll say, universe is a burst of expression of my underlying space-timelessness. But beyond, in the supramental, you will see it all as one continuum, no divisions at all. And therefore, that's the poise from which one has to experience the whole cosmos and everything within. That's where you have the foundation for perfect harmony, flawless, perfect action and knowledge and force, etc. That's why he points to that as our goal and nothing in between. All in between stages are only steps, but we have to get all the way to that. And that's within reach from the state we are in our current evolution, however long it may take.
Earlier you mentioned the subtle body. Would you tell us the difference between the subtle body and astral body?
Okay. So there's a difference of vocabulary. In the theosophical literature, they are the ones who coined the term astral body. They have also a term called etheric body, by which they mean certain distinctions. Sri Aurobindo generally uses the subtle body to describe the mental body, the mental awareness, or the manomaya kosha. The pranamaya itself, we rarely experience in exclusion. A large part of it is embedded in the physical and some part of it embedded in the mental, activating, dynamizing them. So broadly we say we have two lives, physical life and mental life. But life is the common component of both, which is the vital body. And I think this is what they mean by the etheric. But yes.
So when you say our mind can see, let's say, the other side of the cloud, would that be your subtle body seeing in the intelligent mind?
Yes, so in the subtle body, which is your mental awareness body, is where you experience all your senses finally. Remember, through the biology, through the brain, it finally plugs into the subtle mental awareness. And that is primarily rooted in the subtle body. But the subtle body and the physical body are joined right now, and so you do not feel a distinction. In dream state, they separate, and that's why your mind can see things of the dream world and not of the physical world. Good question.
Thank you. What would be moksha or mukti with regards to the levels that you were just speaking about, going in and out of time and space, and then also perhaps related kundalini and ascending and descending way and chakra and all that?
Okay. Okay, the question is about moksha as well as kundalini rising in context of this big picture. Moksha as defined as an experience where you are liberated from the compulsion of birth and death could take place on any of these levels. And like I said, if you exit through the mind, then you would have a particular relation with the world. You could exit on still higher ranges, it would be a different relation. And so the sense of exit itself is relevant when there is a duality and reality is divided somehow. Then you are out of something. But in the highest station, when you see the whole as a continuum, you can take a position which feels as if it is out, but it is always part of the whole. And so that would be a more true experience. At any other level, if you make that split and you are out, then what is the nature of reality? And you have a problem there. So the conventional definition of moksha, which divides reality, is not satisfying as far as Sri Aurobindo is concerned, as far as the goal of the integral yoga is concerned. It's a partial status, even it's an erroneous interpretation of reality. But from the supramental consciousness where the unity is known, you can experience those states, but with the true understanding of what they represent. And so that would be the true moksha. You're not only free, but you're also part of the whole and you experience the reality of the whole while being free. That's when you can be a free participant in the delight of the divine manifestation. Okay.
In one of your seminars, I heard you speak about that the soul knows when it comes to the religion, that you knew when you were 3 or 4 years old, you knew you were going to stay at the My question is, does the soul and the mind, are they connected to each other? Do they talk to each other? Do they know what's going on?
Okay. So if you think of the model we discussed yesterday, koshas, layers, sheets around the center, which is the soul. It's the soul which holds these 3 sheets in their continuity, in their alignment. Or more truly, it is the poise of the soul as centered above, what Sri Aurobindo calls the central being, which holds these 3 sheets together. If it releases its hold, they kind of fall into misalignment. You will see people in whom the thought impulses, emotion impulses, and biology are so to say misaligned. And because the presiding consciousness, the thing which should hold it together, is not asserting itself or cannot assert itself for whatever reason. When the soul puts out an influence, it brings into alignment, but through an influence. It can bring an influence into the mind and you say, suddenly I find these things which I was doing, I'm kind of fed up with them. I need something more satisfying. Where did that come from? You didn't choose it. It just happened. An influence of the soul in the mind would tilt the balance of your thoughts or interests, but it can only do that much initially. But when the mind becomes quiet and begins to turn to the soul aspiration, begins to feel it, and begins to consciously reflect it or align to it, then the soul can put out a more direct influence. It can actually direct the thoughts now in a certain direction, fill the mind with the perception of this aspiration or this yearning to know. And in the mind it takes the form of wanting to know the truth. In the heart it takes the form of wanting to experience the closeness and intimacy with the divine in love. Through the senses or the will, it takes the form of wanting to serve the divine or experience the reality of the divine, etc. But that's the soul's influence filling these. So initially it is influence. Later, as these parts turn and choose to make the soul their center, it can take charge and fill them and live directly as the true person. Yes.
About the complete transformation, so the way I have read it, so is that like a cellular transformation? Is that the last stage of the transformation?
So we discussed yesterday stages. The mind can turn upon the life energy and body and transform them. The intuition can turn upon all these and raise them. Eventually, in the supramental consciousness, taking all these up would be the most complete and the most perfect result. And most complete because it will include all the way to the most material part, including the cells of the body, awakening in them not only the awareness of the divine, but changing the law by which they function. Currently they are driven by the law of physics, law of biology, which we will call law of matter, and transform them to act by the free action of the divine will. Meaning, what makes the cells do what they do? The divine will seated within, choosing to grow, flow in this way. Now, as a correspondence, only as an idea, if you live for yourself as an ego person, I want to do this, I want that, that's your life. But when you are filled with the divine presence and it fills you with joy and the sense of purpose that it brings, and you live now and act by that, all your motives change. All your responses to circumstances change. Your power of action on a situation is also different. Where earlier it was only bound to reaction, now you can act with greater and larger freedom and force and deeper understanding. The same thing happening inside a cell, where a cell is currently reacting by biological action and reaction and instinct of life embedded in cell, a fully conscious and revealed divinity acting within that now in power to master its circumstances, not dependent on those current relationships of dependence of biology. And so effectively, the mother says, it will have the form that the cell would be effectively mortal or capable of being immune to any limitation, to whatever extent it chooses to be. And yes, that would mean the body itself now would function by different laws, by the freedom of the divine will. So the full scope of what that means, we can of course imagine. But an understanding of it will depend on the true nature of the experience of the supramental. You see, in the supramental consciousness, infinity is its first term. Oneness is its first term. And what does it mean for a cell to experience infinity and oneness? So you don't even know what that means for the mind. So it's difficult to conceive of it. But with these few words, one gets a sense of it, and that's all we can say now. Yes.
Can we control our dreams, like especially the nightmares, or suppose when we face some adverse situation physically, and the same situation or something different, but it is very empowering and it affects the dream and it affects us. So can we control it?
What do you want to do to control the dream? To get rid of a nightmare?
Get rid, yes.
Okay, yes. You can, of course. If in waking consciousness you can choose to think differently, certainly you can do it also in dream state. Because that's when your mind is really free even. Okay? The problem is this. Are you really able to control your thoughts in your waking state or your emotions? And if you're not, your dream is only a continuance of the somnambulism of your waking state. In your waking state, you are like a half asleep automatic life. That's what you will have in your dream state. So the first training for becoming conscious in the dream is to become conscious in your waking state. Interesting. And into that you bring this idea repeatedly in your waking state. Am I dreaming or am I awake? Let me become conscious. And with the intention that this would replicate in the dream state. Do this for 3 days. By then, in the middle of the dream, you'll suddenly find yourself thinking, am I dreaming or am I awake? And you'll become conscious in your dream. It's the first point of contact. The point is the dream replicates what you do in the daytime. And then you can put a special will. Just before you go to sleep, you put an intention that I wish to become conscious in the dream. Or if you want to get rid of your nightmare, the first thing is you change the level at which you enter sleep. If you're entering at the level of your daily routine and your problems where you have your nightmare, you shift yourself into a higher, deeper aspiration, do something with reading of Savitri, something which lifts your consciousness, meditate on the divine in your relation with the divine, and then go to sleep in that. The nightmare won't happen. But yes, you can train yourself to become conscious in sleep, and it's a fascinating experience. Literally, you can will reality to take different forms. It's beautiful. Recall the possibilities of the divine sense and where we are in relation with it. Recall the possibilities of a more full and complete experience of reality which belongs to you in your birthright, so to say, in your divine origin. And let's aspire for that to grow.